Welcome to another installment of Speaking of the Arts. I'm Charles Evans, Long Bay Symphony Music Director, and today I want to talk to you about the music we have coming up on our Sunday, April 18th concert. This is actually the last in our 2021 series of concerts that we've had at First Presbyterian Church here in Myrtle Beach. And I think of all the four we will have done in this series, it is, I think it's the most entertaining. Certainly with the cute title From the Sublime to the Ridiculous, you can imagine there's a wide variety of music as well as I can tell you, just different period styles. What we have, and it's quite by accident, I think, not intentional, but the two, shall we say, sublime works are works from the Romantic period, and the two ridiculous, or if not ridiculous, maybe just humorous, are from the early 20th century. So I'd like to sort of run a timeline through this and begin with our earliest work and take it up to the most recent. The first piece we have is just a wonderful instrumental gem in miniature by a composer who is known for very large-scale works. Richard Wagner is one of the most significant composers in music history. What he basically did was build German Romantic opera from its more high-profile origins with Carl Maria von Weber and Giacomo Meyerbeer into a real intense, more integrated, epic style of German opera. This is something he called Gesamtkunstwerk, or complete artwork, where all the elements, the visuals, the drama, the singing, the orchestral playing is all fused into one integrated whole. In fact, one of the biggest developments is that he eliminated this idea of number opera, which is to say, you start with an overture, then you go to, and there's applause, and then you have a series of arias and recitatives, and there's applause between, at the end of arias and bravos and stuff like that. That's kind of all gone with this all-encompassing, focused, lengthy work. And speaking of that, all of Wagner's operas are basically based on German or Nordic mythology, for which he wrote his own librettos. So Wagner's operas, his mature operas, are entirely of his creation. So they're very epic and lengthy, and as far as large size too, the orchestra as well increases in size. You only have to think of, say, the famous Ride of the Valkyries from the Opera die Valkyrie to imagine that all that extra brass. He developed extra new instruments for his purposes. There are Wagner tubas, which are in between regular tubas and French horns. There's bass trumpet that he developed, and the contrabass trombone, and several other instruments. So everything about Wagner's vision was epic and large, all the way down to his final goal of having a special opera house in which to execute these grandiose works. So after many, many years of struggle, he was able to come up with the construction of this great opera house at Bayreuth in Germany, which was sort of his perfect home. It had a huge orchestra pit, all the effects that he needed. Everything about Wagner's vision was this complete, intense German nationalist artwork project, of music drama. He didn't even call it opera anymore. It was music drama. The unfortunate thing about it is that Wagner's intense German nationalism, and admittedly his anti-Semitism, was something that was seized on later, and so he became sort of the model cultural element during the Nazi regime that was sort of embraced as, look at this Aryan superiority. So Wagner unfortunately still has that stain very much on his music and his own personal legacy. But in addition to that, to his anti-Semitism and so on, he had an extremely colorful life, ripe for drama and reproduction. And so some of you may remember that Richard Burton starred in a mini-series, I believe it was in the early 1980s, about Wagner. And, there's, like I said, there's so much to work with. Just in a nutshell, he grew up his stepfather was involved in the theater. So Wagner, as a young boy, was very involved with that, intended to be a playwright. And then when he heard Beethoven's symphonies, that really was a major shift in his thinking, and he wanted to be a musician. So he studied music and began to write instrumental works, and then graduated into starting to write. He wrote an opera that had never been performed in his lifetime. And during this point, in his early 20s, he was getting small jobs as a chorus director in a town, or even the director of the opera in a small town. So he was trying to put all that together while composing. And during that early period, he met his first wife. She was one of the cast in one of the works he was doing, I believe, at Königsberg. And he met and eventually married her. And it's just a long story of a life being wrecked by womanizing, getting into affairs with all sorts of women who were acting as benefactors for him, actually. Also running from debt. And so by the time he and Minna had gotten married, he was working in Riga, which is now Latvia. And he ended up fleeing. They ended up fleeing secretly, just leaving the area and going all the way to London to escape creditors. They were so badly in debt. And they ended up settling in Paris for a while, at which point he was eking out a living. They didn't really enjoy Paris very much, but he eked out a living doing arrangements and some other work, but also writing operas. And so he was able to secure a performance in Dresden for his first big success of an opera, Rienzi. And once that occurred, they moved to Dresden, where he had a fairly stable period. He worked there in Dresden. He was a director. He was writing operas. And yet again, because of finances, he got involved with some of the left-wing politics. And of course, around 1848, 1849, everything was in revolution. And so he got involved with the insurgents for the May Uprising in Dresden, and he thought pragmatically that overturning the regime would help him retire his debt. And again, he had amassed a lot of debt. Well, it didn't work, and as a matter of fact, there was a warrant out for his arrest. So again, they had to flee. He ended up fleeing to Switzerland and was in exile there from Germany for about 12 years. And this was a real important period in his life where he wrote essays on his thoughts about the direction of a new music, what he was going to develop. He was writing operas, and I think very significantly also began writing the libretto, the text, for his greatest crowning achievement, the Ring cycle, as it's commonly known, the Ring of the Nibelungs, which is it's a 4-opera cycle based on the same German and Nordic legends as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that set of books, as well as the movies that have come out and been big box office successes for the past, 10, maybe 15 years. But at any rate, he wrote that and started to work on a new concept, as I had earlier described, about opera as a complete artwork. And he was, in the meantime, begging for performances. He actually managed to get Franz Liszt, the great virtuoso pianist and great musician and conductor, to premiere his Lohengrin, his opera Lohengrin, in Weimar. So he was trying to work, get connected to the musical community as best he could, but he went over a decade without any performances, so it was a very difficult time for him. But in 1862, the ban on his being in Germany was lifted, so he managed to come back and entered into a series of benevolent encounters with families who were enamored of his music and willing to be benefactors for him. And on more than one occasion, he messed that up by getting romantically involved with the wife of the gentleman who were providing him funds. So, you know, he had a very rocky road that way financially. But the big moment came when in 1864, King Ludwig, who was 18 years old and a little bit unstable, ascended to the throne of Bavaria. And so he was also an ardent Wagner admirer. So he summoned Wagner to Munich and basically bankrolled Wagner's projects for a long time. It got to the point, though, where the court, the other members of the court, basically forced Wagner out because he was meddling too much in the politics, because he had so much of the king's ear that he was affecting things too much. So the king set him up in a little house on Lake Lucerne called Triebschen, and this is where we are in the story. And of course, the scandalous stuff doesn't stop. But in 1870, he was at Triebschen with his second wife, Cosima Wagner now, but only recently. This piece that you'll hear in the concert, Siegfried Idyll, is actually a birthday gift to Cosima. And it was also in honor of their recently born third child together. And the interesting thing about it is, Cosima Wagner was actually Franz Liszt's daughter. So she was born Cosima Liszt, and she early on in her life married the great German conductor Hans von Bülow, who was also an ardent Wagnerite. And von Bülow arranged the piano vocal scores for many of Wagner's operas and premiered a lot of them. And so he was part of that Wagner entourage. Well, in the middle of that, Wagner and Cosima had begun an affair, and it took their having 3 children and the death of his wife, Minna, his first wife, who had come in and out of his life. They had a very rough, uneven relationship, on again, off again. It took all of that before von Bülow would finally grant a divorce. So they had just recently gotten married after the birth of their third son. And it's interesting, or their third child, all the kids were named after characters in Wagner's operas. So it's Isolde from Tristan and Isolde, Eva from Die Meistersinger, and then we have Siegfried from the opera Siegfried, which was not yet written. So in 1870, we get this beautiful little gem of a piece that he wrote to honor Cosima on her birthday. And, of course, also the birth of Siegfried. And so that was very much in the material. Now, musically, Wagner had gotten through the composition of the first 2 operas of the Ring cycle, the Rheingold and Die Walküre. And he started on the 3rd episode, the 3rd installment, Siegfried, but abandoned it to write other operas, other single operas that he thought might be more possible to get premieres of, just a single opera. So he wrote Tristan and Isolde and some others. And then he finally, after this point, when Siegfried was born, he returns to Siegfried and finishes that up, and then Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, the 4th one. And then by the time we get to, I think, 1876, he has eventually convinced King Ludwig even to help him with the construction of Bayreuth, and he was able to premiere the Ring cycle as well as all his other operas at Bayreuth. But just to point out the relationship, this little private piece that he wrote, he couldn't help but to draw from. And so there are 2 themes that he uses that are integrated into the final scene of Siegfried, in which the hero Siegfried breaks through the wall of fire to find Brunhilde, who had been put to sleep by Wotan, her father Wotan, basically the Zeus of this mythology. And he discovers this woman behind this fire barrier, kisses her, and of course they declare their unending love. And so he had taken these 2 tunes to make that duet that finishes the opera Siegfried. So it's just a lovely little tune like this. And then another thing that occurs later was also used within this same duet. And then put in there in the fabric of this little essay, Siegfried Idyll, is also material that's very reminiscent of the opera Siegfried. You've got some forest murmurs where woodwinds, there's a scene in Siegfried when it's called the Forest Murmurs, where the woodwinds are imitating birds. There's some of that in there. And then, of course, the inescapable horn calls that are part of Siegfried. There's a nice spot in the middle of it where there's a horn call and these bird calls as well. So it was sort of a gestating set of ideas that he ended up incorporating into Siegfried, and to finish that ring cycle before he could move on and get that done. So it's a gorgeous little gem, like I said. You don't find many examples like this. It's like the Puccini chrysanthemums that we did. Puccini is known as just an opera composer, as is Wagner, essentially. But there are these few little gems, and this is just one of the best. Now, to move on to our next romantic composer, we sort of have one who represents that next generation. And he was also a great ardent Wagner fan, and that's Gustav Mahler. Now, Mahler was born in a Bohemian village that was part of I guess it would now be the Czech Republic, that was part of the polyglot Austro-Hungarian Empire. And at the age of 15, he ended up, of course, he had great musical promise as a young child, and he ended up going to the Vienna Conservatory and was exposed to all of the greatness, the musical greatness that had been there from the time of the classics, from Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven all the way through. And when he was there as a student, Wagner made at least 3 appearances, came to town and did performances of his operas. So he was very involved, as was everyone, in that magical milieu that was Wagner's style. In fact, before I forget, I should mention that Mahler's career was a bit divided, because in order to make a living, he also, like Wagner, ended up directing mainly orchestras, and he was extremely good at it, and was one of the greatest conductors of his time, ascending to the Vienna State Opera position, which was a highly coveted position, and was legendary with his exacting standards. And so he finally was politically sort of moved out of there, because he was very demanding, ending up at the end of his life actually coming to New York and conducting at the Metropolitan and also the New York Philharmonic. So it's a very interesting career that he split between being this conductor and then a composer, which he did mainly in the summers. But his first composition was a cantata, and it's interesting, even though it wasn't an opera, it was still a dramatic work that he himself wrote the libretto for, based on German folklore. So you can sense that thread of connection between Wagner and Mahler's earlier works. It was called Das klagende Lied, or the Lamenting Song, and it seemed like a telling start, but it was never clear why he didn't move into opera. He ended up being a real symphonist, following more in terms of what Bruckner was doing at the same time as Wagner. And so Mahler is known for these gargantuan symphonies that involve, as Mahler put it, the symphony needs to embody the whole world. And so he included in his compositions offstage bands that would interject in the music, cowbells for atmosphere, as though you were listening to the music in a big valley and there were cows grazing. A lot of radical ideas like that, but just trying to encompass as much as possible, embrace as much of humanity as possible in the compositions. And then of course you have the Symphony of 1000, the 8th Symphony. and so on. So he's basically known for these big symphonies. But the interesting thing is his whole compositional style for his symphonies was intertwined with his songwriting, which really in many respects was much more intimate, was as far as scale and scope. But it was absolutely part of his identity as a romantic musician. And so what we're going to play and perform on this concert are 3 songs that are part of a collection that a collection of German folk poetry, basically, that Mahler and many other composers used. It's called Des Knaben Wunderhorn, or the Youth's Magic Horn. And it was a collection that was put together by 2 writers, von Arnim and Brentano, right at the beginning of the 1800s. And it was almost like a declaration of German nationalism. It was at a very precarious time when Napoleon was invading, and there was a great need for this sense of German nationalism. So many other things, nationalist efforts were going on, but this one was very symbolic, to the point where the great philosopher and writer Goethe even admonishes, he evaluated these books of poetry, folk poetry. He said every German home should have these books. That's how elemental they are to our German culture. And so Mahler was equally enthusiastic about them. And so he even set a number of them earlier on just for songs with piano accompaniment. But after he got into a certain level of maturity, all his art songs were set with orchestra. And so he has a whole set of mature orchestral Wunderhorn songs, of which we will do 3. And they are they're very charming, they're very folksy, and very telling, I think, as certainly in the 3rd one, as to, Mahler's desire to kind of make a point, I should say, without getting into too much detail. But we have this set of 3, and the first, which will be sung by our soprano, Shannon Dooley, it's called Rheinlegendchen, or A Little Rhine Legend. And it's just a sweet little story about a young girl who's out working in the fields and dreaming about her beloved, and wondering, what she was saying, what good is a ring if my beloved is not around? And so she has this feeling that, what if she just tosses the ring into the river and it gets swallowed by a fish, and the fish then is caught and ends up being served to the king. And when the king discovers the ring, he asks, "Whose is this?" Whereupon her sweetheart will answer and say, that's my lover's. I'll take it back to her. So it's just a very sweet, innocent little story. And I think the type of romantic style that Mahler exhibits is much more of a sweet ornamental chromaticism based on his inevitable link with sort of folk music, being of a more bohemian cut. It reminds me very much of the chromaticism and the sweetness of Johann Strauss and those types of waltzes. So here's just a little bit to give you some idea of that ornamental chromaticism. This is just a little passage from this Rhine legend that I was just describing. So it's this kind of thing. Let me do that again. So you get the idea. There's a lot of just poignant but innocent, ornamental, I would say, chromaticism. But that's, of course, not the only feature of Mahler. In his symphonies, he's quite ambitious tonally and points easily into the 20th century. But then that's our first song. The second one is a good deal more intense. It's called The Song of the Prisoner in the Tower, and it's a duet. And so Jeff Jones, our baritone, will sing the prisoner's part, which is basically, there's a recurring refrain of, my thoughts are free. He's locked, he's a prisoner of war, locked in prison, and trying to imagine better times. And the one thing he can say is, my thoughts are free. They can't take those away. They can't imprison those. And all of those statements, as they evolve in desperation, are alternated with his beloveds singing about the beauty of being together, being in the summer, being out in the open in the fields, enjoying their time together. And so it's sort of a back and forth between those two forces, to the point where it gradually becomes more futile to think about the idea of the two rejoining. So the last stanza is about how hopeless it is that, he may die here, but his thoughts are free. And even when he's gone, his beautiful thoughts with his beloved will still exist. So, and it's interesting to consider that Brentano, one of the pair that came up with these volumes of Wunderhorn folk poetry, was responsible for getting the Brothers Grimm to get going on their book of fairy tales. So, and you remember a lot of those are in fact quite macabre and grim. The third song we'll do will be just for the baritone, and it's now getting into a little bit of the ridiculous part. This is a satire, and it really fits Mahler's thinking, I believe, because I think progressive musicians are always very self-conscious about being criticized for being different and for developing new ideas and having them not be accepted. And what it's called is In Praise of Lofty Intellect. And basically what it is that a nightingale and a cuckoo are having a discussion, and they decide that they're going to have a contest between the two of them to determine who sings better, who sings prettier than the other. And so they decide to enlist the aid, and they figure because the donkey has such large ears, he's a perfect candidate. And again, I think that's a real tongue-in-cheek element of the poem that Mahler must have loved, to make the deduction that because this donkey has large ears, that he must have the ears to listen to the quality of his music. So they have this contest, and the nightingale begins to sing, and it's very pretty, and yet the donkey says, oh, it's too complex, it's too complicated, I can't handle this. And then the cuckoo comes in just with a very, and the donkey, being, very simple, says, oh, that's great, I understand it, I love it, the beat was right on, I declare you the winner. And so it's a very funny, brief, satirical poem that I think Mahler was particularly attracted to for his own purposes. So those are our two romantic works. Now we move ahead into the 20th century and, to an extent, into the ridiculous. And our main piece in that realm is by a composer who was known as sort of the next generation of English composers after, say, Ralph Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst. That would be Sir William Walton. He was born in 1902, so he's sort of a generation ahead of what those guys were doing. His father was a church musician, and so as a result, by age 10, Walton was in Oxford, going to school and also serving as a choir boy in one of the church choirs there. And he continued on to university in Oxford, and yet he was never able to get his degree. All his music coursework was fine, but he could never pass the sort of general exams. So here he was, not graduated, and with nothing to do in his, late teens, early 20s. And he hooked up with a couple of classmates of his, of the famed Sitwell family. That's Osbert and Several Sitwell. And he became sort of a surrogate brother with them, and they were part of an eccentric family. Their father had been in the House of Commons and was a well-known politician and writer, and is typical of that sort of Victorian eccentric behavior. And in addition, they had, and this is the connection, they had an older sister, Edith Sitwell. Now, all of them were of a literary bent. They were writers and critics and so on. But Edith was primarily known and was fairly praised as a poet. And so the four of them did a lot of traveling in Italy. Walton lived with them in London, and he had never had that kind of experience actually living in the big city for that long. And so at one point, Edith had composed these poems that, and her style was very abstract and utilized a lot of the symbolist poetry thinking, like of the late French symbolist poets, where there were a lot of words in the poetry just to remotely suggest things. So it wasn't totally clear, it was just oblique imagery, and a lot of onomatopoeia and rhythmic elements in it. And so she wrote some poems that had been published in some of the journals that the Sitwells put together that came out periodically. And she suggested to Walton, she said, I think this with what I've written in here, with all the rhythm and the references and so on, would be kind of charming to set to music. And so Walton took the challenge and set a group of them, these poems that were under the grouping called Façade, and created an entertainment out of them. And that was premiered in 1922 at a private party. And it was just a crazy kind of production, which was very, very typical of the 1920s. And as a matter of fact, just this whole idea of having a narration and with musical accompaniment was a rather unique thing. And the only precedent I could say for that had come, that would have been in the thinking, was Arnold Schoenberg, the Second Viennese School, the 12-tone composer. His early work, Pierre Lunaire, which was a milestone, and most musicians had become aware of it. It had been composed some 10 years earlier, at least. And it utilized a reciter, a narrator, but one who sort of spoke between speech and song in something called Sprechstimme. But at any rate, that was sort of the only precedent I can think of that would have made this kind of medium something that someone like Walton would think of. So we have this interesting sort of street band kind of ensemble consisting of flute and piccolo, clarinet and bass clarinet, saxophone, trumpet, percussion, and cello accompanying this music. And when it was first done, Edith Sitwell's voice, as she was reciting the poetry, was not big enough to project over the ensemble. So they had this huge megaphone that she spoke into from backstage with a painting of a big face on the curtain. And of course the megaphone opening was the mouth. So it was kind of scandalous when they did their private performance, but it was interesting enough and intriguing enough to where they thought, well, they should do a public performance. So the next year they did a public performance in London, and it was equally scandalous. I thought it was a little bit humorous that Noel Coward walked out, and I guess in disgust, but he was kind of taken aback by the whole thing. But just to give you an idea of the poetry, like I said, it's very rhythmic, onomatopoeic, making random indirect references, and also is imbued with sort of a certain Victorianism that we associate as being so very English, and elements of the colonialism that was such a big part of English thinking at that time. So I want to read you just a couple of excerpts from that. Here's one. This is a fairly short poem called Mariner Man. What are you staring at, mariner man? Wrinkled as sea sand and old as the sea. Those trains will run over their tails if they can, snorting and sporting like porpoises. Flee the burly, the whirligig wheels of the train, as round as the world and as large again, running half the way over to Babylon, down through fields of clover to gay Troy town. A puffing their smoke as gray as the curl, on my forehead as wrinkled as sands of the sea. But what can that matter to you, my girl? And what can that matter to me? And then just another short bit from the ending of another one of the songs, that, or one of the pieces with narration. This is just the closing section. The Admiral said you could never call. I assure you it would not do at all. She gets down from table without saying please, forgets her prayers and to cross her T's. In short, her scandalous reputation has shocked the whole of the hellish nation, and every turbaned chinoiserie with whom we should sip our black bohea would stretch out her simian fingers thin to scratch you, my dear, like a mandolin. For hell is just as properly proper as Greenwich or as Bath or Joppa. So they're very tongue-in-cheek. They're actually quite ridiculous. And the music equally reflects that kind of attitude. It's very entertaining. There's one called Popular Song, there's one called Scotch Rhapsody, and it summons everything from seafaring tunes to popular songs of the day. And so it's a very humorous, enjoyable reading and musical rendering of these poems. So I think you'll enjoy that ridiculous part of this journey. The one remaining piece we have on the program is relatively short, but represents this sense of Mexican nationalism, which was fairly late to bloom. This is a piece by the Mexican composer Silvestre Revueltas, who is fairly known for a few works, Senza Maya, and there's an homage to Federico Garcia Lorca. And this piece is called just simply Ocho por Radio, or 8 musicians broadcasting, is basically it's just a simple 6-minute sort of radio broadcast piece. But Revueltas was born in 1899, so right around the same time as Walton. He was a fairly proficient and well-known violinist and conductor. He conducted several orchestras in Mexico. Was aligned with the other musical great who was part of this Aztec Renaissance, this awakening of the cultural norms of Mexico, along with the social reforms that came in the 1920s. That is Carlos Chavez. And the two of them were very responsible for defining Mexican music, very much like in the visual art field, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. This reference to an Aztec revolution was really to the idea of the Romance, very much like the German Romantics, looking back on that folk poetry. They were looking back to the origins, the Mexican natives, and not so much the Spanish culture that had infiltrated, but looking back in a nostalgic way at the earlier times in Mexico's culture. So they utilized a lot of those elements in their arts, in visual arts and in music. Now, Revueltas' music is pretty, I would say, explicable. He uses a lot of Mexican mariachi music, essentially. So there's a lot of street music in it. Every time you hear violin passages or trumpet, they're very much locked into those idioms of mariachi music. But he weaves this all into a sort of a pastiche, a sort of a collage, in the same way that Stravinsky does with his music. Stravinsky also was using very simple Russian folk ideas, but he would lay them over on top of one another in such a way as to create a dissonance or a sort of a general disharmony. And that's kind of what happens in Revueltas' music. You'll be going along with a simple folk tune, a sort of a bit of mariachi music, and then it will be interrupted by some sort of jarring rhythmic change or some brief tonal interjection. Then it gets right back to its going about its folk business. So in that regard, it is a little bit on the ridiculous side. It's very humorous. Most of his music has this kind of interjection, but it's certainly a fun style and a fun idiom to hear this sort of Mexican nationalism in this brief piece by Revueltas. And it's interesting that Revueltas actually wrote a lot of film music, and certainly for the Mexican film industry, and was involved in the Pancho Villa films, and actually appeared in a movie called Let's Go with Pancho Villa as the saloon piano player. And there's a little sign that he wrote on there, you know, don't shoot the piano player. Maybe that's where that phrase comes from. But at any rate, I think we've got a really sublime and ridiculous program coming up on Sunday, April 18th. So I hope you can join us either live. Tickets are available live now for that. That's Sunday, April 18th at 4 o'clock at First Presbyterian Church in Myrtle Beach. But you can also get it live streamed. You just get on our website, longbaysymphony.com, or you can get on our Facebook page and purchase a live stream ticket for $15. And I do also want to make a quick plug for the fact that we are moving on with more performances as things start to clear up with our pandemic. So we have scheduled for May 7th, that's Mother's Day weekend, that's the Friday, May 7th, a performance at the Pelican Stadium, an outdoor performance of Classical Mystery Tour, which is a Beatles review for instrumentalists. Relive the Beatles with the great orchestrations that you heard from many of them that George Martin made. So it'll be a fun evening at the baseball stadium on Friday, May 7th. And we've got lots more planned after that. We look forward, as you do, to getting back to normal routine as things start to lift. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you soon.